The following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
Joe, when you came up to my office a couple of weeks ago, literally on the day the President announced his jobs bill, we discussed many different issues, including his proposal and the proposal to reduce the deficit and how it would impact New York City. There is obviously a clear, renewed focus in Washington on fiscal accountability, but it's also evident that this is part of an electoral strategy to play off populist anger. It'll be interesting to watch as these issues unfold over the next few weeks, and with the deadline nearing for the supercommittee to resolve the budget deficits. What concerns us most is the impact on the President's proposals on New York City. Congresswoman Maloney just came up to me and started talking about that issue, and we must remain vigilant, particularly on the proposal that limits eligibility for tax deductions, including those for charitable contributions, state and local taxes. We've been to that party before, to the so-called Buffett rule, and the increasing rate on carried interest and enterprise value. New York could suffer if all of these tax increases are imposed, in addition to possible cuts on the spending side. The city's economy is doing much better than most other cities, but we cannot afford to have these proposals move forward without fully understanding its impact on our city and our state. Now more than ever, we need to work together to make sure that we are treated fairly. We at ABNY, together with our partners at the Citizen Budget Commission, REBNY, the Real Estate Roundtable in Washington, the Partnership, and other organizations, look forward to working with you, Joe, and the rest of our congressional delegation to ensure that New York is treated fairly. Congressman Crowley sits on the influential Committee on Ways and Means, and he also serves as Chief Deputy Whip for the Democratic Caucus, making him the highest-ranking member among the New York Democrats to serve in leadership. We surely need your help, Joe, and we will work together with you and our delegation to make sure New York is treated fairly. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce a friend of both ABNY and our great city, United States Congressman Joe Crowley. Joe.
Thank you, Bill, for hosting this great event this morning, and especially during these fascinating times that we all find ourselves living. But this is New York, and every day is a fascinating time. But there is no doubt that our economy is still hurting, and while New York is doing better than most, we are not in the boom times either. High Analytics did a recent report where they highlighted that if we fall back into a double-dip recession, something of concern based on what we're seeing in Europe right now, that it would be an especially odd recession at that. Families are saving more and have more cash on hand, and businesses are sitting on record amounts of cash. The whole issue comes down to confidence in our economy, and there is little of that right now. Families are worried that they may lose their job or see a pay cut, and are conserving their resources, still cutting back on luxuries that they traditionally purchase. Businesses are not seeing people return to the stores and showrooms, and are afraid to make new investments because the customers and the consumers may not follow. So while people are saving more, something that in the 1980s and the 1990s economists urged Americans to do, it is now a factor in our economic slowdown, which is looking to consumer spending to try to revive it and drive it forward. The fear of unemployment is also pervasive in holding this economy back. There are many reasons why we're here today, but the main issue is how we return consumer confidence to the nation's living rooms and its boardrooms. The crisis appears to have been ignited by the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which resulted in banks not trusting each other, credit freezing up, and the normal course of borrowing grinding to a halt. Banks have started to lend once again, but the credit standards are much, much higher. Does that mean that banks are still stingy, or that credit was too easily available pre-Lehman Brothers? Companies are also quite effectively getting more out of their workers through greater productivity. so there is less need to hire new people, resulting in those with jobs likely to keep them, and those without more likely to have a harder time finding work in the past. But the pontificating for the economist is for the economist, and as a policymaker, I am continually working to find ways to create a solid foundation for private sector job growth and hiring, as well as ways to encourage consumer confidence and reasonable levels of spending. And I'm proud of some of the achievements made during the Democratic tenure in the majority in the House of Representatives. We undertook a number of bills to help, which became law, and they did help, but it wasn't enough. We passed into law the Small Business Jobs Act, which over the past 4 months put more than $4 billion into the hands of 332 small community banks across the country for the purposes of those banks turning around and using those funds to make small business loans. The incentive to make those loans is twofold. The banks themselves had to proactively apply for the funds, and the rate a bank had to repay the government would shrink as they made more and more loans. We enacted this program to help provide new incentives to make the types of loans that freeze up after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Congress also enacted a tax credit, the hire credit, to encourage businesses to hire, and it had some success with businesses in my district, according to a survey conducted by the Queens Chamber of Commerce. And while I generally agree with those who argue that few businesses would make a decision on hiring based on a temporary tax credit, the goal was to provide those businesses on the fence an incentive to hire. I also want to note that I am prepared to support another plan to provide incentives to hire workers once again. Again, the goal would be to push employers who may be on the fence, especially about the coming year, to hire now. We also passed a higher education bill that increased the amount available for Pell Grants to make college more affordable for middle-class families. And I see my friends from Fordham University, some nodding their heads. Not you, Father. What's going on? Now you're nodding. Workers who do not have a college education or another specialty trade are far more likely to fall through the economic cracks. Furthermore, a college or vocational education is a must in today's global world, and we need to take every step possible to both prep kids for college through a solid, strong public education system, and then make college more affordable and affordable for the masses, including apprentice training and craft development. And then there was the enactment of the Recovery Act. I appreciate that there are criticisms of the bill. It was too big for some and too small for others. But at the end of the day, it had a clear impact on this city, creating or saving over 26,000 jobs. And that's not my statistics. That comes from the mayor's office. Beyond our city, it created or saved, and this is according to the more conservative estimates, at least 1.5 million jobs in the United States. My guess, it saved even more. But where would we be today had that bill not passed, I ask? The Recovery Act also provided new grants and loans to advance domestic green energy manufacturing. And while people will pounce on the cylinder story, they ignore the larger facts. First, jobs that were created. Second, in an emerging industry, there will be failures. It's a reality. But we shouldn't abandon investment in American ingenuity because one company fails to succeed. For example, in 2009, the day Barack Obama became president, the U.S. had 2% of the world's market for high-powered batteries to make hybrid and all-electric vehicles. Today, we have 20% of the world's high-powered modern battery market, in large part because of incentives the president successfully pushed forward. This created jobs, and new plants sprung up because of the incentives contained within the Recovery Act. The bill also contained billions of dollars in infrastructure spending, often financed through the very successful Build America Bonds program, which led to the issuance of over $137 billion in new infrastructure projects by state and local governments. This includes over $13 billion in infrastructure projects in New York City alone, including at the Battery Park City Authority, the MTA transit improvements, school construction and renovation by the city. New schools, more efficient roads, cleaner power plants, these created jobs and invested in our people. The Recovery Act also included the funding for the Cash for Clunkers program that helped bring millions of Americans into showrooms to purchase new made-in-America cars. And let's not forget that without President Obama, we would not have a domestic auto industry left in the United States today. He used a portion of the TARP funds to save the American auto companies, and today Chrysler and GM are not just alive, but are rehiring once again. And while Ford did not use those funds, they too implored Congress for this bailout, saying that they would also go under if the other big two went down. I feel so strongly that our nation's recovery and future success should have no partisan boundaries, but that is not the path we're on right now in Washington. The successes I mentioned, keeping Detroit running, expanding access to a college education, and the enactment of the Recovery Act were done without strong across-the-aisle support. And now that Republicans are in the majority, the divide has only further solidified. Yes, the near shutdown of the federal government was averted last week, but we cannot keep edging closer and closer to a crisis. It isn't a responsible way to govern, and it is very dangerous to our fragile economy. I think many of you either know me personally or know of my record. And year after year, regardless of what party is in the White House or what party is ruling the roost in Congress, I've always prided myself on working with members of both sides of the aisle. I view myself, in many respects, as a deal maker. But the current state in the U.S. House of Representatives, there's no one to deal with. The Tea Party Republicans are focused on roadblocking progress, not advancing road construction. Now, the one issue Tea Party Republicans are committed to is to reducing the federal debt. And I absolutely agree we must bring it under control. But the question is not if, the question is how. I don't believe in obsessing about how during a genuine, real emergencies in a year when we have had unprecedented wildfires, drought, hurricanes, and even an earthquake here on the East Coast. In fact, the small town of Amsterdam, New York, had an earthquake, hurricane, and a tornado, all in the matter of 2 weeks. No, we should not be looking to find funds to cover those costs, especially if it means cutting jobs or hurting middle-class American families at the same time. Yet Republicans have insisted we find a place to cut in order to pay for that emergency relief. In fact, many say we need more family values in government, including running our budget as if it were a family. But no family in this country immediately offsets disasters. If the boiler blows in the middle of the night or a water pipe breaks, families get it fixed ASAP, regardless of the cost, because it needs to get done. However, it might mean they run up their credit card bill and pay more interest, or maybe they fall a month behind on their rent. It isn't good news, but it is a reality, and that reality exists for the federal government in some instances as well. The Republican Tea Party is also opposed to the government playing a role in an economic recovery. Many Democrats, including myself, take the opposite view. With our competitors overseas helping their domestic industries, so should the U.S. We need to make sure we can still manufacture and develop and innovate. And yes, it takes government investment to create a platform for that kind of private sector success. Whether it be in government laboratories designing high technology or medical advancements or assistance for our homegrown auto industry, there's a role for the government to play in boosting domestic job creation. It was interesting the cuts that Republicans wanted to make in the disaster relief bill. One was for a green energy program that has created thousands of jobs and helped make us U.S. industry leaders within that sector. The other cut was to U.S. automakers to develop more efficient cars, a program that the automakers credit with creating over 40,000 new jobs in the United States. Slashing incentives that are creating jobs and advancing U.S. industries, especially in this economic environment, does not make any sense to me. So it brings us to the actions we need to take to move our country forward. Recently, I've said that at times like these, what the American people want aren't handouts. They want their elected leaders to have a vision for success, a vision for America to maintain its strength. The President has put forward a plan, the American Jobs Act, and there are some good things in it. Sure, there are some things that concern me as well, but it is absolutely a conversation starter, an attempt to look forward. It proposes a half a trillion dollars in mix of tax cuts and new spending. Some of the proposals I think are worthwhile, and they are tax credits to encourage new hiring, extending unemployment insurance, and investing in our infrastructure. I believe we can supplement this plan by recreating the Build America Bonds program. The now expired tax credits bonds created under the Recovery Act launched over $137 billion in new infrastructure spending nationwide, all at a cost of only $4 billion to the U.S. taxpayer. To date, the Republicans have not scheduled hearings or actions on President Obama's jobs plan, but I truly hope that changes when we return to session this week. Again, Americans are looking for us to lead, and turning a blind eye to the President's efforts on the jobs front is simply unacceptable. I also support President Obama's call for consideration of the 3 pending free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. And I have personally been working to make some small but needed reforms to the tax laws known as the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, also known as FIRPTA. FIRPTA has created barriers for foreign investment here in the U.S., especially in the commercial real estate market. We need as much liquidity in the commercial real estate market in New York and nationwide as possible. And we shouldn't be turning down any legitimate investment in our country. That's why Kevin, Rep. Brady of Texas, and I, and he's a Republican, recently introduced a bill to reduce those barriers. As I mentioned, there are a few things in the President's package I have concerns about, including some of the revenue raises. I have concerns with the carried interest offsets as it included in the proposal written by the President. There have been some good conversations about on this issue amongst the tax writers in the House and the Senate and the White House on the issue of carried interest, including the exclusion of enterprise value and other steps to ensure a greater equality in the tax code while not at the same time suffocating investment potential. I was hoping these conversations would be reflected in the administration's job plan, but they weren't. However, as the opponents of the original carried interest proposal have stated, there is a compromise out there, and we should and ought to work towards that. If we're looking to raise revenue, and I believe we must in order to address our deficit, we should levy a surtax on those earning over $1 million a year. Now, I understand that may not be popular proposal for many in this room, but we need a mix of tax increases and spending cuts to get this budget in line. And I believe a millionaire surtax at the federal level is the best way to go. It also allows us to pursue a balanced approach to reduce the deficit. I also believe it is better than advocating tax increases that directly target particular industries. But there are many pending issues on the desk of Congress, and I have a real fear that they will have to wait until the elections, as there is a real move by the House majority to deny this president any victory, even if that victory would be a victory for the American people and our economy, and even if it is an idea that the Republicans like as well. But even with that outlook, I still like to say something about the U.S. There's a lot of talk about our best days being behind us and our country faltering. While Washington has not put the best face forward in recent times, I would argue with anyone about the decline of the country or our people. I do not see anyone looking to leave the U.S. to immigrate to Europe or Asia or South America or anywhere else in the world, quite frankly. People are still dying, literally dying, to get into this country for a better life for themselves and for their families. And that's the measure by which I judge this country. And we need to remember this when we are working to tackle our ongoing challenges. We're still the shining city on the hill for so many people worldwide, and together we can make a better country in the future than we ever have been in the past. I thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions you may have in the time remaining.
What do you think the chances are that the Kerry Hutchinson bill for a national infrastructure bank might be passed by the House?
I think it's critical. I think we ought to create that. Some have suggested the use of repatriation as a means by which the tax that would come in, albeit at a much lower rate than 35%, be placed into an infrastructure bank and therefore leveraged to create even 10 or 20 or 30 times the amount of capital that would be available for infrastructure. I think that's one aspect and one avenue by which we should be looking to expand those opportunities. What I will suggest, and this is maybe some food for thought as well, the President has proposed a little over $100 billion in infrastructure reform, including school construction and school modernization within the jobs bill. At the same time, my Republican colleagues in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee are actually discussing cutting by a third the TLU levels. So on one end you have investment potential, on the other hand looking at further and more deeper cuts in infrastructure. I don't think at a time when we're teetering that we ought to be putting more and more people out of work or not providing opportunity for men and women who want to work, and at the same time advancing the country. I said in the past that the former ranking member then became the chairman of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee when the Democrats were in the House leadership, lived in Minnesota. And that didn't leave me a warm, fuzzy feeling in my belly when that bridge collapsed in Minnesota. Now, we invest here in New York City. The city of New York and the state, especially at the Schoharie bridge collapse in upstate New York, but the city has always invested in its infrastructure, much to the chagrin oftentimes to New Yorkers when we have to, abide by the additional traffic. But we need to do that, nationwide. And just a commercial, I watch a lot of television, at night, as most of us do, going to bed, trying to fall asleep. And I like those commercials that Rachel Maddow has because it talks about investing in the future and, what have we done in this generation, like, the Hoover Dam and the GW Bridge, I would make observation of even the Triborough Bridge. And those are the kinds of investments. And by the way, I think we actually need a bridge I'm not from Greenpoint, but I think you need a Greenpoint bridge to Manhattan. I'm from Queens, but I got stuck down there. I said, how do I get back to Manhattan? How do I get back? But those kinds of things, I think, are what we need to be investing in as well. Big picture, long-term investments that help get product to market and that help ensure that they do and give those short-term and long-term jobs and good quality jobs back to Americans.
On the jobs portion of the proposal, health care is not included. Yet on the deficit reduction proposal, health care is included by having cuts, particularly aimed at teaching hospitals. So in effect, there is a whipsaw effect between the job creation being financed by the healthcare community, which today in New York is the largest private sector employer. I point that out to the room as much as I know you know about this, but this is very, very troublesome in terms of policy. Thank you.
I think there's no doubt that the cuts to GME and IME are troublesome, especially in the sequestration process. If the Committee of 12 cannot come up with a solution, and quite frankly, I think we need a big solution. I know that their mandate is for, 1.5 trillion, roughly thereabouts. And the reality is I think we need to be looking even more long-term. And I say that at risk. I come from a very safe Democratic district. But I do think in the interest of our country, we need to get our fiscal house in order. Having said that, I don't believe in going after just one sector. And I think what we saw happen even in the debt relief discussion, which was entirely fictional. We don't have time to go into that right now, and I think you probably know what I'm talking about. But in the end, I believe that although Social Security and Medicare beneficiaries were not included in any sequestration process, we do know that Medicare providers are. And we still produce something here in New York City. We don't manufacture as much as we ought to anymore, but we still make 1 out of every 6 doctors in the United States, as you well know. And because of the Affordable Care Act, which we passed into law that will cover more and more Americans, millions of more Americans, it is estimated we're going to need another additional 200,000 physicians by the year 2035, and especially in the primary care physician field. So we're actually moving backwards instead of forwards in terms of the needs. And how that will actually directly impact Medicare beneficiaries is that when they go to the doctor or go to the emergency room, instead of taking 3 hours to see a doctor, it will take 7 hours if they see a doctor at all. And that's the concern that we all, including Carolyn, myself, and the New York delegation, expressed in our vote on the debt ceiling.
It seems to me that the Republican Party, influenced by the Tea Party, has a kind of a radical agenda. They really want to move the country in an entirely different direction. There are an awful lot of people who are dissatisfied with the political system, dissatisfied with the economy, and I think they're drifting in that direction because the Tea Party is more mad about it than the Democrats are. So what's the message that's going to energize Democrats? It can't be we're better at compromise than the Republicans are. It can't be simply we'll look out for your interests a little bit better, you know, depending on what the particular circumstances are. We saw in Queens recently that, you know, the traditional way of doing things just wasn't enough to overcome that anger. So are we looking forward to the Republicans taking the White House, having both houses of Congress? And, you know, and if that's not a thought that's appealing, then what is the message that's going to change that dynamic?
Special elections are a snapshot, and there are a lot of issues that confluence into what happened on that particular day, not the least of which was a 67-33% vote in Brooklyn. But having said that, I think that there were a lot of things that took place that day. And in retrospect, looking back at the 26th Congressional District up in upstate New York, where for the first time in many, many, many decades, a Democrat was elected in a widely Republican-held district. And what that said to me was that Democrats and Republicans in upstate New York went out of their way to vote for a Democrat to express their anger. And at some degree, here in New York City, Democrats who have never voted Republican in a local election in their lives went out of their way to express their anger, and maybe given the nature of that district, felt it was safe doing that. In that many believe that the district may not exist in the future. Whether that is true or not, we don't know, but that was at least a belief that was widely held. And sending a message to Washington. You know, people say to the president, I think there is that aspect. I certainly think it's also a message to Congress. They want us to work together. Unfortunately, though, Ken, I think the reality is the president said we didn't have 14, now 13 months to wait to take action. I think it may take an election to wake up the rest of the electorate, and you know, unlike a special election, a general election has different outcomes, and especially in the 9th Congressional District, I think that's the same case.
Joe, thank you for your straight talk and honest views on all the events that are happening around our country and our city, and we look forward to working with you and your team. Thank you very much.